All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, August 11th, 1973, Justice William Douglas of the Supreme Court grants bail to the so-called Fort Worth Five, a group of Irish-born New Yorkers jailed in Texas since January for refusing to answer a federal grand jury's questions about illegal gun purchases. Their case had risen through the legal ranks and gained a fair amount of press because the group had steadfastly refused to cooperate with law enforcement inquiries into gun shipments from America to Ireland. These weapons were intended to help the IRA and the ongoing fight for Irish independence. So here we have the Nixon administration going after American citizens, run through the lens of the Irish independence movement. And I will say that, if you thought that the decades-long, centuries-long fight for Irish independence was a little confusing with all the factions and splits and so forth, now we get to throw on all sorts of freedom fighters in the U.S. and other sort of factions and so forth. So it is quite a interesting web, but luckily someone has done a fantastic job of reporting on that web. There's a new podcast called Foreign Agent Reported and hosted by Nate Lavey, which is all about the IRA's American connection and the regular Irish Americans who found themselves caught up in this freedom fight. It is truly excellent, I will say, and I listened to it a few months ago and binged right through it. And we welcome Nate Lavey now as our special guest to talk about the Fort Worth Five. Nate, thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me.
And with us here, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of, and I usually say Columbia, but now I'm saying Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt, and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Well, hello from Vanderbilt. Hey there.
And yeah, we're post Tennessee Week on the show. This is our first episode since Tennessee Week, which was fantastic. I loved it, and thank you for doing that. But so now we've officially entered the Niki at Vanderbilt era. But Nate is still affiliated with Columbia, and so we still have some Columbia representation. I don't think we should shed too much of a tear for Columbia here. Yeah.
The Ivy League will make it through somehow.
Yes.
Fine.
Yes. So Nate, we are big fans of groups that name themselves as a place and then the number of people in the group, right? And we don't do that enough anymore. But the Fort Worth Five, I just said these are a bunch of Irish Americans. They all live in New York. Why in the world are they called the Fort Worth Five? What's the Texas connection?
Yeah, well, the story does sort of end up in Texas, but it sort of starts with a few suitcases that were left on this sort of grand steamer ship that had docked in a port of Ireland. And the suitcases were filled with weapons, submachine guns and grenades, handguns, ammunition, that were all wrapped in newspapers from the New York area. And as you said, these guns were headed to the Provisional Irish Republican Army. And at that time, in the early 70s, the IRA was really dependent on money and guns coming from the United States. And a few years earlier, in 1970, a few folks who had been involved with more moderate and civil rights groups that had been focused on Northern Ireland decided that it was time to really back the armed struggle as opposed to sort of more constitutional, nationalist, or civil rights-based approaches. And they called themselves the Irish Northern Aid Committee, or NORAID, which is the focus of our podcast.
Yep.
And at first, they're sort of doing this charitable work, sending clothing to families who've been burnt out of their homes. But pretty soon they become associated with people who are, pretty high-ranking members of the IRA. And by 1972, there's a major sort of escalation when British troops shoot and kill 14 unarmed civilians during a civil rights march that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. And all of this sort of changes the entire nature of the conflict. Sort of up until that point, it's really more of a street-based civil rights movement. And after that, it becomes, something that looks much more like a war. And at that same moment, NORAID sees sort of an influx in money and donations and support. And also at the same time, the British government and the United States government start taking a look at who's sending weapons to Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm. And then how does Texas get roped into this?
Yeah, so in 1972, the United States Department of Justice starts handing out subpoenas to people who are living all over New York. And it's a lot of folks, but 5 men get selected to go face a grand jury in Fort Worth, which is investigating illegal gun running to the IRA. And those men, as you said, were all Irish-born, but they were mostly living in the Bronx and around New York. And their names were Ken Tierney, Matty Riley, Pascal Morahan, Tom Laffey, and Danny Crawford.
I believe that they are Irish.
Yeah, exactly. Very much so. Very much so. But they were interested in activism around, Irish freedom. But it seems pretty likely that they were not involved in gun running. And even the federal prosecutors knew that pretty early on. But it seems like in the context of the grand jury, they were looking to try and get information about other people who were running guns and those connections to the Irish Northern Aid Committee.
I'm always kind of baffled a little bit because when you look at their names and what they did, one's a real estate agent, one's a nurse, one's a bus driver, one's a house painter, one's a carpenter. These are regular Joe Schmoes, they're regular people that you would not necessarily suspect of being gun runners, and yet here they are in this predicament. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, totally. One of the sort of fascinating things is, our story really starts in Irish-American communities in New York and Boston and Chicago, and those sort of ethnic neighborhoods that were really rooted in a sense of Irishness. At that time, they're really working class neighborhoods. And this sense of the importance of Irish freedom, stretching back hundreds of years, is also deeply rooted there. And it's interesting how quickly folks who have very normal everyday lives, all of a sudden through their activism get linked up with armed struggle and, guerrilla groups thousands of miles away.
Because even if these men weren't necessarily involved in the gun running operation that the government was investigating, there are the people who are involved are working class jobs. I think there's a story in the series where some guy gets off of a 13-hour shift and then goes to do his chicanery with NORAID and with helping with these arms sales. So it's one of these things that feels so deeply embedded in the Irish-American community and really stresses, I think, too, the lasting ties between even 3rd and 4th generation Irish-Americans and the fight that's happening in Ireland.
Yeah, I think that's right. One other way to think about that is to flip it. It's these are people who are not professional gun runners, right? They're not doing this as their job. This is something that they just care about. And in a lot of ways, is their hobby. They're going to demonstrations, they're handing out pamphlets, and then they're also collecting guns and putting them on boats to Ireland.
Yeah, and their social circles.
Side hustle.
Yeah. But I think you paint a really great picture in this about how a group like NORAID, there were lots of layers to the onion and the activity, and sometimes it was just, we're a social group and we hold music events and people come here and then we raise money for causes and some people donated money, but then there were people on the inner circle who were pushing the envelope and doing things that, eventually would lead to things like gun running and so forth. But it was I think it's a nice reminder that these groups are part of larger networks that often are just social networks and cultural networks. But I'm curious, you talked at the beginning about the escalation that's happening in the early 70s and how that's pushing the envelope and it leads to we need more guns and more guns being shipped from the U.S. to Ireland. Which side of the ocean was was pushing that? Was it the IRA reaching out to their American counterparts and saying, we need weapons, or were the Americans in a way kind of saying, hey, we can do this, we want to do something, let's push forward?
Well, so going back to basically the 1800s, there's been a connection between militant Irish nationalism in the United States, and people have been sending money and guns and ammunition in support of Irish nationalism, since before there was a Republic of Ireland. And so those networks have sort of always existed, and I should say continue to exist. There are still people who are involved in one way or another with militant Irish nationalism today. But in this specific case, some representatives from the Provisional IRA in 1970 make a trip to New York, and they have two purposes. One is to say, we need a support group that's going to help us fund our activities. And they approach the men who eventually found NORAID a few months later. And then they approach another set of men who are friends with the first set and say, you've been running guns for our people for, 10, 20 years. We want you to start it up again. And basically those guys say, yeah, we're in. It's a moment where there's significant street fighting going on in Northern Ireland. Television is sort of like beaming back these images of civil rights protests being attacked really brutally. And they can tell that there's sort of a war that's about to kick off. And these people, as we've said, are ideologically and emotionally really committed to that cause. And so they're ready. And so it's really a joint effort.
And Nate, there's two stories in the 1960s and the 1970s that you could fit the IRA struggle in. And one is the civil rights story, Black civil rights in the United States. And then the other is growing concerns about foreign terrorism, which becomes increasingly important in the 1970s. How do Americans tend to think about the IRA in this period? And how useful are those frameworks for thinking about it?
Yeah, I guess, one thing to flag is that NORAID never represented the broad swath of opinion of Americans or Irish Americans. Most Irish Americans probably did not care about Northern Ireland. They didn't care about the IRA. They were living their lives in the United States. They were not activated by these issues and causes. For a smaller number of people, NORAID represented their point of view of, the looking at the history of the struggle and saying that, peaceful attempts have failed over a period of hundreds of years. The only thing that is going to eject the British from the island of Ireland is armed struggle. So, that's a pretty tough sell, I think, to most people. But the thing that I think is powerful about NORAID is that although they did sort of back that militant and armed component of the struggle, they were active on the streets. They had a pretty significant PR operation. They made connections with sympathetic politicians. They published their own newspaper. They appeared on radio shows. They really did their best to create a narrative that could bring Irish Americans into the struggle in a way that maybe they hadn't been included in the past. And, not only were they countering sort of, hesitancy amongst Irish America, but the British government had an actual sort of like propaganda campaign that was aimed at the United States, trying to shape the narrative around the Trouble by feeding footage and sound clips and interviews to television and radio stations and newspapers. And so NORAID took it upon themselves to try to rebut and reshape that argument. And in doing so, I think really, ended up reshaping how many thousands of Irish Americans saw the political violence in Ireland and actually gave them a stake. I think it rejuvenated a sense of the importance of this identity of being an Irish American. I think you can maybe trace sort of a drop-off of people caring about Irishness in the 40s, 50s, early 60s. And when the Troubles comes back and when Irish Northern Aid is saying this is a cause that we ought to care about, it reactivates in people a sense of their own identity that then carries them on for about 30 years.
as this is all playing out, as Niki hinted at, there is obviously a civil rights struggle in this country. And it's one of my favorite episodes of the series where you actually go back in time and sort of do the whole how the Irish became white kind of history through the 20th century, but then really land in this moment where there were really interesting questions and lots of tensions around what counts as civil rights struggle. Should it feel solidarity with American civil rights movements? So can you just paint that picture a bit and the factions that emerged?
Sure.
In 30 seconds.
Yeah. I think broadly speaking, you can see a sort of diversion in the politics of race amongst people, who stay in Ireland, essentially, and those people who end up in the United States. And the particular history of race making that goes on that brings Irish people into the white race in the middle part of the 19th century really ends up shaping their political formation in a way that is just as deeply rooted as the sense of Irish nationalism. And so you see this quite distinct set of beliefs taking shape on either side of the Atlantic, where the IRA, especially later on in the 70s and 80s, takes on a much more like left-wing cast to it. And the civil rights movement that sort of gives birth to the Troubles, in a way, is definitely being influenced by the American civil rights movement. And is, again, seeing these images of people in the Black freedom struggle in the United States, that's being beamed to their homes in Belfast and Derry. And they're seeing this type of struggle emerge distinct from the armed component that they have this history with as a new sort of method of struggling against this sort of like undemocratic state. And so they feel very strongly towards the Black civil rights movement. They make connections with different civil rights organizations. There are even members of Black civil rights groups that go to Northern Ireland. I think famously Angela Davis has been many times. But those sort of warm feelings, that sense of a kinship in struggle and this sense of these struggles being connected is not shared by Irish Americans, who in fact take the exact opposite point of view, where and I don't want to generalize about every single Irish American, but many Irish Americans sort of feel that their politics are sort of about Ireland and about the border. It's not about civil rights per se. Because if they sort of like begin down that path of civil rights in Northern Ireland, it then unlocks a question about like, well, what's your relationship with civil rights in the United States? Yeah. So sort of before 1969, all the groups that are doing any sort of work about Northern Ireland in the United States that are sort of based in Irish America are really focused on the border and not about civil rights. And in fact, you have these early members of Irish Northern Aid who stake out fairly reactionary positions and, try to distance themselves from the Black civil rights movement.
Yeah, I always thought that these relationships were sort of one way. I saw very clearly how the civil rights movement has influenced movements all over the world, outside of the United States, where people have sort of like hooked on to the rhetoric, the language, the performance, the music, all of that. But oftentimes I don't see how it goes in the other direction, meaning I don't see oftentimes a lot of Black people who become entrenched in these other movements and understand them very well. In that sense, it seems like it becomes more of a one-way street. You do have people like Angela Davis and others, but I don't think it's part of the mainstream for Black people to be linking like their movements to other movements outside of the U.S. or that they're aware of that within sort of the public historical narrative that gets left out.
And then to ask it a little more pointedly, I mean, you have, let's say, white Irish Americans in Boston who are, taking a certain stance around civil rights and towards Black Americans in, the busing struggles or civil rights struggles, but are also supporting Irish independence, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's squared because they're able to compartmentalize these fights. They're not seeing them both as these are all people who are fighting for liberation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could maybe even push it a little further. I think you see instances in which Irish nationalism or Irish republicanism is put in service of white supremacy. That this idea about Irishness, which on the one hand, like galvanizes a community, gets them to care about a struggle that's thousands of miles away, is also put to use, to attack Black people. And you even see this in, last year's St. Patrick's Day parade in South Boston. There was a neo-Nazi group that was marching, or was on the side of the parade with a sign that said, "Keep Boston Irish." So this like sense of Irish identity and its connection to Irish nationalism can take very divergent sort of paths.
This is so crazy to me because the Irish, like, especially during the 1920s, like, the Klan is lynching Irish people. They are burning down their churches. They're terrorizing Catholic people on par with the ways that they terrorize Black communities. And that was a lot of reason that they grew in the 1920s, was because of this anti-Catholic sentiment. And so to see it get reversed in that way is sort of like, what? We've forgotten everything. But yeah, that amnesia, I think, is a big part of the problem.
And just to put a bow on it, I mean, one of the people that you mentioned in the series, Nate, is Louise Day Hicks, who leads the anti-busing activism in Boston, who are using Black civil rights techniques of marches and sick-outs and sit-ins and claims to white rights in order to resist desegregation in Boston. So it's all tied together in a pretty odious stew.
Yeah. And I should say, that like odious stew was pointed out by Irish activists. So most famously, Bernadette Devlin McCalliskey, who was a civil rights leader in Northern Ireland in the 60s and 70s and who remains active today, went to Boston during one of these busing protests and said explicitly, what you are doing here towards Black people is what Protestants do to us in Northern Ireland, and we reject your politics and wish that you would sort of like take the same side that we see ourselves on. So it wasn't lost on people in Ireland, the sort of like racial politics that were happening in the United States.
And there were, I think you hinted at it, but to be clear, there were people within NORAID and within the struggle here who were pointing out, a liberation struggle anywhere is a liberation struggle, and they were feeling kinship with the civil rights movement here on that on that front.
In terms of NORAID specifically, they end up becoming a fairly big tent organization, and there are these different sort of ideological tendencies that exist within NORAID. So there is a right wing and there is a left wing, and those are in tension in some ways, but they also find ways to work together. But there were certainly people involved in NORAID who would have described themselves as communists, who were interested in Black liberation, people who worked with the Black Panthers, with the Young Lords, who were interested in queer liberation, by the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. Well, it's good you mentioned that, because one other thing that would maybe bond all these groups together was that the government was going after them and trying to break them up, right? And that's really a big part of this story, and a big part of this Fort Worth 5 is that we've done episodes on COINTELPRO in the early 70s and sort of the way that the FBI was going in and trying to and other organizations was going in and trying to crack up these groups. And interestingly enough, I mean, with the Fort Worth 5, that seems to be one of the reasons that they're able to wiggle out of this is because it is happening in this larger era of people realizing the dirty tricks that the government is using to go after these groups.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the Fort Worth 5 themselves, they recognized very early on that the government was sort of on a fishing expedition to find out stuff about their friends, their neighbors, people in their community. And they refused to participate and sort of like pulled these antics or hijinks to tie up the grand jury investigation as much as they could. They'd communicate only in Irish Gaelic, and if their lawyer who spoke Irish wasn't there, they would demand a translator, which, like, of course, there was none in Fort Worth, Texas in 1972.
Doesn't the lawyer have a dentist appointment at some point?
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. And they sort of like make a mockery of the whole investigation. And through that are really able to turn it into sort of a media event that galvanizes people around Irish Northern Aid, around Irish freedom, but also ends up bringing in sort of like big name Irish-American politicians like Ted Kennedy, who takes up the cause of the Fort Worth Five as something for him to essentially like beat up the Nixon Justice Department about.
Yeah. Which is crazy because these men, correct me if I'm wrong, they all have immunity. So they're not going to get in trouble by speaking out, and yet they still continue to maintain their silence about this, which I think shows you sort of the solidarity that they feel for this.
Yeah, absolutely. They're pretty early on. It's clear that that they're not going to talk about themselves for sure, and the government grants them immunity, and then they still refuse to do it. They know that this is political, that this isn't just a criminal investigation, and that they do feel sort of an obligation to their community, to their cause, to keep their mouth shut.
There's also this great story that you tell about Michael Flannery, who is one of the co-founders of NORAID, who is arrested as part of one of these federal charges for conspiring to arm the IRA. And he claims that the CIA had led him to believe that he was cooperating in a CIA sting, and so therefore wasn't responsible for his actions in putting together these arms deals, which I think really does play on that suspicion that Americans had in the late 70s and the early 80s that the federal government and the intelligence community was behind all these things.
Yeah, that gun running case, which takes place about 10 years later, is wild. It is totally bonkers. And like their defense that the CIA was in on it is also just like unbelievable, that they would make that case in federal court. Is extraordinary. And exactly. I think by that time, there was a lot of suspicion, and much of that court case ends up being about the sort of like dirty tricks that the CIA is up to. And they make it into a case about Irish freedom and about the complicity of the CIA in a variety of, illegal activities throughout the 60s and 70s.
Amazing.
And, I'll just say the series covers a lot of territory, but, this is certainly a through line. I mean, pressure and infiltration and people switching sides and suspicion and all that stuff. I mean, it really, this is a story that has so many parallels to, the Black Panthers and other activist groups and so forth. I mean, just the immense amount of kind of pressure and fictioning that was going on. One last thing as we start to wrap up. I mean, this is recent-ish history. I mean, this is there's a lot of stories, right, that I think are happening right now that are looking to the 70s and 80s, and I think part of that is because we're realizing we still have a chance to tell these stories, and though some of these people are still around. I'm just curious, some of these characters in the Fort Worth Five or some of the people who you profiled in this, are there people still around, and kind of what is the state of this activist group that was so fervent in the 70s? Where do we stand now?
Yeah. Well, like many groups in the 70s, Irish Northern Aid went through some splits, where as the conflict changed in the 80s and in the 90s, and it became clear that sort of a decisive military victory was not going to happen in Northern Ireland, people started to think, okay, well, we need to adjust our tactics. And essentially, a faction in Ireland decides that they're going to start contesting elections and taking the fight into sort of like a parliamentary system, which has supporters in the United States. But some of the leaders of Irish Northern Aid, including Michael Flannery and including some of the famous gun runners, really see the abandonment of the armed struggle as being the death of the movement. And I would say that, these folks are still alive, and those fractures remain, that there are people who still, are living up in the Bronx and in Chicago, who, fall along those sort of political divides where, just in May, there was a sort of important election in Northern Ireland where the Nationalist Party, Sinn Féin, won the most votes for the first time. And there's a lot of people who were excited and supportive of that. And you'll still find people who are involved with Irish Northern Aid in the 70s and 80s who disagreed with the move towards parliamentary politics, who think this was a betrayal and that this election was actually the final seal on the failure of the movement.
But you interview a few of them for the series, including a couple members of the Fort Worth Five, right? Are still around. So
Yeah, that's right. I spent some time with Ken Tierney, who is still very much sort of interested and involved with Irish activism. And you're right. These folks are sort of they're older, and I think it's true that.
How old is he? He's got to be in his 90s.
I think he is in his 90s now. I think I spoke to him maybe when he was 89, but I think he's in his 90s now. And so this is sort of in some ways the last chance to sort of get some of these stories on tape.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, one last thing, totally unrelated. There was another Fort Worth Five. Do you know the other group that has dubbed themselves or was dubbed the Fort Worth Five?
Was there a train robber gang?
Yeah. Okay. So the only photo of Butch Cassidy and his group, and who were called the Hole in the Wall Gang, and they were mostly based in Wyoming. But the only photo of any of that crew ever taken was taken in Fort Worth, and there were 5 of them, including Butch Cassidy. And so that is often referred to as the Fort Worth Five. This is the second Fort Worth Five. There's only so many places and so many numbers.
Fort Worth, all places.
Well, because
not L.A., not New Chicago.
Yeah, we should do an episode on this. But they have long had that statute on the books that you're only allowed to hang out in groups between 4 and 6 in size, and so it's just it's inevitable that you get that. All right. Anyway, so yes, maybe we'll do another. We haven't done a Butch Cassidy episode, but maybe we'll get to that. Anyway, Foreign Agent is the podcast. It is truly excellent, folks. As summer winds down and you maybe have one last road trip in you or something, listen to it. It's really fantastic. And Nate, thank you for doing it. And I know you had a sort of, I don't want to use co-conspirator given the subject matter, but you had someone you worked with on this podcast closely. You want to give him a shout out?
Yes, my good friend and co-producer Michael McCann was really key to making this all happen as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, this was really great. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Nicole Hammer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And I ask you here today to continue to support Northern Aid, give them all the encouragement. They know the cause they're serving. And I ask you as sincere Irish men and Irish women to make sure that help will come to Ireland, because there can be no turning back this time.
Radiotopia.